Las Vegas is a place the world usually associates with bright lights, endless casinos, luxury hotels, and the promise of fortune around every corner. For decades, it has been marketed as a city where dreams are built, where millionaires are made overnight, and where luxury lifestyles are not just possible but almost expected. But what if behind those flashing neon lights, there is a darker story, one that reveals not just the fragility of fortune, but also the fragility of Nevada's real estate empire itself? When you think of Las Vegas, you might imagine towering mansions with infinity pools overlooking the desert, streets filled with high-end cars, and investors pouring billions into ambitious housing projects. Now picture the opposite. Entire neighborhoods with houses abandoned, swimming pools filled with dirt, and prime land reduced to barren lots no one wants to buy. This shocking contrast is the reality of Nevada's housing collapse, and it is a story most people outside the state have never fully understood. The transformation was not sudden, but to the public, it felt like it happened overnight. One day, developers were promoting luxury communities with names like Desert Paradise and Canyon Retreat, promising buyers a slice of the glamorous Las Vegas lifestyle. The next day, those same properties sat empty, overgrown with weeds, windows shattered, and walls tagged with graffiti. The image of Nevada as a booming real estate paradise collapsed in a way that even the most cautious economists failed to predict. To truly grasp the scale of what happened, we have to consider the environment leading up to it. The city of Las Vegas was not just selling homes, it was selling a dream. Investors from across the United States and around the world were convinced that buying property here was a guaranteed path to wealth. Entire subdivisions were purchased by out-of-state buyers who had never even visited the area, trusting only the promise that prices would rise forever. Families stretched their finances to the limit, believing that owning a home in Las Vegas was not just achievable but necessary, because waiting would mean being priced out forever. What followed was a spectacular unraveling that turned the state of Nevada into a cautionary tale. Mansions that once sold for millions ended up on foreclosure lists for a fraction of their original value. Empty plots of land, once marketed as prime investment opportunities, became eyesores scattered across the desert. For every success story of someone who cashed out early, there were countless families who lost everything they had. The fallout wasn't limited to the people who invested either. The crash rippled through Nevada's entire economy, dragging down businesses, reducing tourism revenue, and leaving scars that remain visible even today. This is the story of how a place famous for chance and risk became the site of one of the most dramatic real estate collapses in American history. From luxury mansions to empty lots, from dreams to ruin, Nevada's housing collapse isn't just a chapter in the past. It is a warning of what can happen when unchecked speculation collides with fragile economic foundations, and it is a story that deserves to be told in full detail. Before the collapse, Nevada's housing market was one of the hottest in the United States, and nowhere was this more visible than in Las Vegas. The city was growing at a speed that seemed unstoppable. New casinos, resorts, and entertainment complexes appeared every year, attracting millions of tourists and thousands of new residents. With the influx of people came an urgent demand for housing, and developers rushed to meet it. Entire master-planned communities emerged from the desert almost overnight, each promising buyers not just a home but an entry ticket into the glamorous Las Vegas lifestyle. Between the late 1990s and the mid-2000s, home prices in Las Vegas surged at a staggering pace. Modest houses that once sold for under $150,000 doubled and even tripled in value within just a few years. Newspapers ran stories about ordinary people who had flipped a house and made six-figure profits in less than 12 months. The belief spread quickly. Nevada real estate was not just safe, it was the quickest way to get rich. Realtors became celebrities in their neighborhoods, and construction companies could not keep up with the demand. Investors from California, New York, and even overseas treated Las Vegas as the new gold rush. But beneath the glittering surface, cracks were already forming. Many buyers were not local residents who intended to live in the properties. Instead, they were speculative investors, often buying multiple houses with borrowed money. Banks and lenders played a critical role in inflating the bubble, offering risky loans with little documentation and unrealistic promises. Families who had modest incomes suddenly found themselves approved for $500,000 mortgages. Adjustable-rate loans seemed harmless when home prices kept rising, but no one was prepared for what would happen once the growth slowed down. By 2005, signs of trouble were already visible. The pace of new construction outstripped the number of permanent residents who could realistically live in the homes. Some neighborhoods had more empty houses than occupied ones, but developers kept building. Billboards across the city advertised brand new luxury homes with incentives like free pools, upgraded kitchens, or even cars included with the purchase. It was a desperate attempt to keep the buying frenzy alive. Behind the scenes, financial experts warned that the market could not sustain itself, but their voices were drowned out by the optimism of a city addicted to growth. For the average person driving through Las Vegas at the time, the future looked limitless. The skyline sparkled, cranes filled the horizon, and gated communities expanded deeper into the desert. Yet, the seeds of collapse were already planted. What most people did not realize was how fragile this entire system was, built not on sustainable demand, but on speculation and easy credit. The higher prices climbed, the further they drifted from reality. And then came the turning point. Interest rates began to rise, mortgage payments became unmanageable, and suddenly the dream started to crack. Families who believed their homes would only gain value were now trapped, and investors who had gambled on multiple properties faced losses they could no longer ignore. The suspense of Nevada's real estate story reached its peak. A bubble stretched so far it could only end one way, by bursting. The story of Nevada's housing bubble begins with a powerful illusion, the belief that the desert could endlessly transform into paradise. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Las Vegas became the epicenter of one of the fastest real estate booms in American history. What fueled this boom was not just population growth, but also a cultural obsession with home ownership as the ultimate sign of success. Owning property in Las Vegas was marketed as more than shelter. It was a lifestyle, an investment, and for many, a ticket to wealth. Developers saw the growing demand and rushed to seize the opportunity. Empty stretches of desert just beyond the glittering strip were turned into massive subdivisions. Streets, sidewalks, and entire neighborhoods appeared seemingly overnight. Each community carried names designed to evoke luxury and exclusivity. Places like Sunset Ridge, Silver Canyon, or Palm Heights. These names promised stability and glamour, and buyers lined up to believe in that promise. The rise of easy credit only poured fuel on the fire. Lenders competed fiercely to hand out mortgages, often without requiring proof of stable income. The now infamous no-doc and stated income loans became widespread, allowing buyers to take on houses far beyond what they could realistically afford. Adjustable-rate mortgages with low introductory payments looked appealing, especially when buyers believed they could refinance before rates went up. As long as property values kept climbing, few worried about the risks hidden in the fine print. Speculation soon overtook genuine demand. Investors began purchasing multiple homes at once, treating them not as places to live but as chips in a high-stakes casino. The strategy was simple: buy early, wait a few months, then sell at a profit. Some flipped properties without ever moving in, while others rented them out short-term until they could find a buyer willing to pay more. It seemed like a system that could never fail, and for a while it didn't. Stories spread about teachers, taxi drivers, and casino workers who had become wealthy overnight just by flipping a house. The dream was contagious, and the frenzy grew. But beneath the excitement, warning signs began to emerge. Entire neighborhoods were being built where few permanent residents actually lived. It wasn't uncommon to see rows of newly finished houses sitting empty, waiting for buyers who might never come. In some subdivisions, investors outnumbered real families, meaning that stability in those neighborhoods was built on nothing but speculation. Yet developers kept building and lenders kept lending, convinced that demand would always outpace supply. What made the bubble especially dangerous was the way it reshaped expectations. Ordinary families who once might have purchased a modest home suddenly felt pressure to stretch for larger, more expensive properties. After all, if values kept climbing, buying bigger meant earning bigger profits down the road. The entire housing market began to function less like a necessity and more like a lottery ticket. By the mid-2000s, Nevada was at the height of its real estate mania. On the surface, it looked like prosperity without limits. Construction jobs were plentiful, developers were thriving, and homeowners felt richer by the day. But this prosperity was fragile. The market was no longer driven by genuine demand, but by speculation stacked on top of speculation. The bubble had been inflated to its maximum size, and it was only a matter of time before the first cracks appeared. By the mid-2000s, the Nevada housing market had reached a point of extreme instability. The rapid expansion, fueled by speculation and risky lending practices, had created an artificial environment where prices seemed untouchable. For years, homeowners, investors, and developers alike had enjoyed the illusion of endless growth, but that illusion was about to shatter. Interest rates began to rise, mortgage payments increased, and many families found themselves unable to meet their financial obligations. Adjustable-rate mortgages that had seemed affordable during the boom suddenly became impossible to manage. Borrowers who once felt confident in their investments were now facing foreclosure notices and mounting debt. The collapse did not happen uniformly. Some neighborhoods were hit faster than others, and the luxury sector initially appeared insulated. High-end mansions on sprawling lots, once seen as untouchable symbols of wealth, suddenly became difficult to sell. Buyers who had purchased multiple properties were forced to liquidate assets, flooding the market with supply and driving prices down even further. The market's downward spiral accelerated as fear replaced optimism. What had once been a high-demand area now appeared to be a wasteland, and the streets that were once bustling with construction trucks and hopeful buyers became eerily quiet. Abandoned properties became a visible reminder of the collapse. Entire subdivisions, built with the expectation of constant growth, were left partially empty or completely deserted. Pools filled with debris, manicured lawns turned to weeds, and homes sat unsold for months or years. Investors who had purchased multiple homes faced massive losses, and families who had stretched their finances to keep up with the market suddenly saw their wealth evaporate. The emotional and financial toll was enormous, leaving scars that affected not just individuals but the broader community. Financial institutions were not immune to the damage. Banks that had issued risky loans suddenly found themselves burdened with defaults, foreclosures, and declining collateral value. Lenders who had encouraged aggressive borrowing practices were now forced to write off billions in losses. Nevada's economy, once thriving on the boom, faced contraction in construction, real estate, and related industries. Job losses were significant, and many who had relied on the housing sector for income found themselves struggling to make ends meet. What made the collapse even more dramatic was the speed at which it unfolded. Markets can remain overvalued for years, but in Nevada, the combination of high interest rates, unsustainable borrowing, and speculative investment created a perfect storm. Prices that had once soared beyond anyone's expectations plummeted in months. Families who had assumed their homes would only gain value found themselves upside down on their mortgages. Neighborhoods that had represented status, security, and prosperity became symbols of failure and neglect. The psychological impact was profound. Las Vegas, a city synonymous with risk and reward, had witnessed a real estate gamble that affected thousands. Homes that once symbolized dreams now told stories of financial ruin, and the streets were filled with the remnants of speculation gone wrong. The collapse of Nevada's housing market was more than an economic event. It was a lesson in human behavior, greed, and the fragility of systems built on the assumption that growth could never end. Visible consequences. The aftermath of Nevada's housing collapse was visible everywhere, leaving scars that extended far beyond the financial statements of investors or banks. Streets once filled with the hum of construction and the promise of growth were now lined with vacant houses and empty lots. In neighborhoods that had been symbols of prosperity, it was common to see for sale signs that had remained unsold for months, sometimes years. Pools turned green and overgrown yards signaled abandonment, and homes that had once represented security were now reminders of risk and miscalculation. The physical consequences of the collapse were striking, but the social and economic consequences were equally profound. Tourism, a cornerstone of Nevada's economy, also felt the ripple effects of the real estate downturn. Hotels, casinos, and entertainment complexes depended on a constant influx of workers and residents. As construction slowed and unemployment rose in sectors tied to housing, fewer people were able to spend freely in the city. Local businesses suffered, from restaurants and retail shops to service providers who had expanded rapidly during the boom years. What had once been a city of opportunity began to show signs of strain, and the gap between the illusion of wealth and the reality of decline became impossible to ignore. For homeowners, the consequences were deeply personal. Many who had borrowed heavily to purchase their dream homes suddenly faced mortgage payments they could not afford. Families who had invested their savings found themselves upside down, owing more on their properties than they could sell them for. Foreclosures became common, and the emotional toll was immense. People who had once felt secure in their investments now experienced stress, anxiety, and uncertainty about their futures. Communities that had been built with optimism and ambition were disrupted, and the sense of stability that had once defined these neighborhoods vanished almost overnight. Investors and banks were not spared from the fallout. Financial institutions that had fueled the boom with high-risk loans faced massive losses. Some were forced to write off entire portfolios, and others consolidated to survive. Investors who had treated Nevada real estate as a speculative playground saw their portfolios lose value almost instantly. The collapse demonstrated the interconnectedness of the housing market with broader economic systems, showing how over-leveraging and unchecked speculation could create consequences that touched everyone, not just those directly involved in buying or selling property. Even empty lots, previously seen as potential gold mines, became symbols of wasted opportunity. Land that had been purchased with the expectation of rapid development remained undeveloped, sometimes for years, as the market corrected itself. Cities that had expanded quickly found themselves with infrastructure and roads that led nowhere, creating a visual reminder of overambition and unbalanced growth. Nevada's collapse served as a stark lesson in what can happen when economic optimism outpaces reality, leaving both tangible and intangible consequences in its wake. The visible consequences of Nevada's real estate crash extended beyond buildings and vacant lots. They reshaped communities, altered economic expectations, and provided a cautionary tale that continues to resonate. From abandoned homes to stalled developments, the fallout is a reminder that growth without sustainability can only last for so long. Nevada's story is not just one of lost wealth, but of lessons learned, of communities tested, and of the enduring impact of a market that expanded too far, too fast, and without adequate oversight. While the collapse of Nevada's housing market was widely reported in terms of foreclosures, empty lots, and financial losses, there were aspects of the story that remained largely invisible to the public. Behind the statistics and headlines, there were layers of human behavior, institutional choices, and systemic flaws that contributed to the crisis and amplified its effects. These hidden elements often go unnoticed, but they are critical for understanding why Nevada's real estate market went from an unprecedented boom to a devastating collapse. One factor that receives little attention is the role of speculative investors who treated the market like a high-stakes game. These buyers were not looking for a home or even a long-term investment. They were chasing short-term profits, often purchasing multiple properties simultaneously and flipping them as quickly as possible. While some succeeded, many were caught when prices fell, leaving a trail of unsold homes that contributed to the market's downward spiral. Their actions, combined with the optimism of local buyers who assumed prices would always rise, created a dangerous feedback loop that made the eventual collapse more severe than it otherwise might have been. Another underreported aspect is the complicity of financial institutions. Banks and mortgage lenders played a central role in inflating the bubble by approving high-risk loans and pushing borrowers toward adjustable-rate mortgages with low introductory rates. While headlines often focused on homeowners who defaulted, the institutions that created the conditions for widespread risk were rarely held accountable. Some banks profited from fees, interest, and transactions even as the market began to crumble. Others faced losses. But the structural weaknesses exposed during the collapse revealed systemic problems that extended far beyond Nevada. Local politics also played a significant role in shaping the housing market, yet it is often overlooked. City planners, zoning boards, and development commissions encouraged rapid expansion, offering approvals and incentives to developers without fully considering the long-term sustainability of such growth. The desire to attract investment and create jobs sometimes outweighed caution, allowing overdevelopment in areas that could not realistically support such density. These decisions contributed to the oversupply of housing and amplified the impact when the market began to decline. There is also a psychological dimension that receives little attention: the collective belief in perpetual growth. Homeowners, investors, and developers alike operated under the assumption that real estate values in Nevada would continue to rise indefinitely. This optimism, while understandable in a booming economy, created an environment where risks were minimized and caution was dismissed. Once reality intervened, the contrast between expectation and outcome intensified the collapse, making its consequences more severe and more visible. Finally, the human stories behind the collapse often go untold. Families who lost their homes, employees who lost jobs, and communities disrupted by the downturn are frequently reduced to statistics in news reports. The emotional and social toll, including stress, displacement, and long-term financial instability, is an essential part of the narrative that remains hidden from broader discussions. These personal experiences highlight the real cost of economic speculation and serve as a sobering reminder that financial crises are never abstract. They affect lives in deeply tangible ways. Nevada's housing collapse is not just a story of numbers, foreclosures, or abandoned lots. It is a story of hidden forces, overlooked consequences, and human behavior that combine to create one of the most dramatic real estate failures in American history. Understanding what no one talks about is essential for grasping the full scope of the crisis and appreciating the lessons it offers for the future of housing markets, economic policy, and responsible investment. The collapse of Nevada's housing market left a lasting imprint on the state, the nation, and anyone paying attention to the fragile patterns of real estate speculation. From the streets of Las Vegas lined with abandoned mansions to the empty lots that spread across the desert like scars, the consequences were tangible, visible, and undeniable. But beyond the material losses, the story also serves as a cautionary tale for investors, policymakers, and ordinary people about the dangers of unchecked optimism, over-leverage, and ignoring systemic risks. The lessons of Nevada are complex, and they remain relevant today, especially as other housing markets face their own pressures and uncertainties. One key takeaway is the importance of sustainable growth. The rapid expansion of Nevada's real estate market was fueled by speculation and the assumption that property values would rise indefinitely. When that assumption proved false, the effects were catastrophic. Communities that had been designed for growth became hollowed out almost overnight, and families who had relied on home equity for stability suddenly faced financial ruin. Sustainable growth is not about slowing progress, but about ensuring that development is aligned with real demand, responsible lending practices, and realistic economic planning. Ignoring these fundamentals creates vulnerability to shocks that can ripple far beyond the initial market. Another lesson is the critical role of oversight and accountability. Banks, lenders, and developers all contributed to the bubble, often prioritizing short-term gains over long-term stability. Lax regulations and incentives for aggressive lending allowed risky behavior to proliferate, amplifying the eventual collapse. Policymakers and financial institutions must learn from these failures, implementing safeguards that prevent excessive speculation and protect both consumers and the broader economy. Without such measures, history has shown that similar crises are likely to recur. Perhaps the most important lesson is human behavior itself. Nevada's real estate collapse demonstrates how optimism, fear of missing out, and herd mentality can drive markets to unsustainable heights. Individuals often act on assumptions that prices will never fall, ignoring the possibility of downturns until it is too late. This psychological element, combined with structural weaknesses in the market, magnifies both booms and busts. Recognizing and mitigating the influence of behavioral biases is essential for both investors and policymakers to avoid repeating past mistakes. Yet, even as the story concludes, a lingering question remains: what comes next? Nevada's housing market has stabilized in many ways, but the broader patterns of speculative investment, easy credit, and rapid urban expansion still exist in other regions. The risk of another bubble is never zero, and the lessons of Las Vegas remain a living warning. For those watching carefully, the collapse serves not only as history but also as a guide for identifying warning signs and preparing for potential crises. In the end, Nevada's journey from luxury mansions to abandoned lots is a story of ambition, risk, and consequences. It is a reminder that economic success built on unsustainable foundations can be reversed, often with dramatic and far-reaching effects. As investors, homeowners, and policymakers reflect on what happened, the ultimate lesson is clear: vigilance, prudence, and awareness of both human behavior and market fundamentals are the keys to preventing history from repeating itself. Nevada's collapse is not just a cautionary tale. It is a call to pay attention, to learn from the past, and to act wisely in the face of ever-changing economic realities.